I'm Reverend Tony Lee. I'm the pastor of Community of Hope AME Church. I was born the son of a sharecropper, and no, just joking. I'm Reverend Tony Lee, the pastor of Community of Hope AME Church. What was the other question?
Your title and your role at the church and in the community.
Oh, and we see ourselves as an integral part of community. We believe that you're transformed to become agents of transformation. And so the church's role is not just about what happens in the four walls of the church, but more it's about what happens in the region that the church is focused in.
So tell me a bit about your background and where you were born and raised and your family.
I was born in Washington, D.C., Southeast D.C., was part of the first migration or the early migration of black folks into Prince George's County, and so I was raised in Prince George's County. An amazing family, mother and father, Nancy and Orlando Lee, brother Bill Lee, and actually they all serve with me right here at the church, and so you're a really dope family.
So how'd you get into the Christian ministry? Is it something you were always in? Is that like are you a preacher's kid, or how did it all come about?
So I was raised in the church, but wasn't really living the life, especially as I grew a bit older. And so went through some really challenging kind of times in which I can't say that I was a thug, but I was really thuggish with major violent tendencies. All of my friends, I came up during the crack era, and so, most of my friends were drug dealers, running neighborhoods. I wasn't significantly a drug dealer, but I just dabbled in a bit of all that stuff, but did a lot of antisocial behavior, dysfunctional behavior, got in a lot of trouble.
So the Christian ministry got you.
Oh, how did I get into Christian ministry? My life was a mess. My life was totally a mess. And I realized that I needed some help. And so I'd gone to a service. I had been raised in the church, so I knew kind of what I needed to be doing, but had fallen off so much. And I went to a service and just heard a guy at Ebenezer AME Church kind of talk about relationship with God. And it helped me find my way back. I think the real place where I hit bottom was when I tried to kill my brother. And so me and my brother went in an argument, and I just flipped and just lost it, just kind of blacked out and was choking him to death. And right before he literally was about to pass out, I came to my senses and kind of dropped my hands and went back to my room and realized I really needed some help. And that's when I really kind of reached out to God, reached out to the church, and saw that I needed to kind of transform my life. And that was the moment that I remember most about when I knew I needed a change.
Okay. So, I mean, is that what you would say more or less your members of your church are like, kind of a reflection of you? Or
What, killers?
Tell me about your church members.
So my church members, so we're located inside the Beltway, Prince George's County. Prince George's County is considered one of the most affluent black counties in the nation, but it really is a tale of two cities. The Beltway is kind of like our train tracks, and my community is what you would say is on the other side of the tracks. Our community, when you look at the demographics, is all of the reds, is the highest issues of HIV infection, highest issues of unemployment. Just if you look at all the negatives that this community is a community that has it, and that's why we planted ourselves here. We believe that church is the best where need is the greatest, and so we're here. Our community has a range of people, though. Community has, folks who don't have much, also folks who are just kind of working hard and working class folks, as well as people who work on Capitol Hill. We've got a Pulitzer Prize winner who's here. So we've got this range of people who have come together to be in Christian community, but we really focus really hard on those who were Generation X, Generation Y, those who were unchurched, who hadn't been to church in a long time. We've come together as Christian community to be able to have an impact on our area.
So we're going to transition into the reason why we're here. Why do you think the church should pay attention to teen and unplanned pregnancy?
Well, I think the church needs to deal with the issues of the day and the issues that impact people. And so I don't think there's anything that people are dealing with that the church should shy away from. But the church should be a place where people can come, not just for the answers to their problems, but to be able to talk through the challenges of their lives. And so teenage and unplanned pregnancies is definitely an issue that impacts our communities. And so I don't think that the church in any way can shy away from it, but the church has to be a place, a resource for people to deal with their everyday realities.
So why do you think it happens? I mean, since you're saying we need to talk about it, what's the reason we're not talking about it?
Oh, I thought you were going to say, why do people get pregnant? I was going to say, young man, if you don't know that, then we're going to have another conversation
start from the beginning,
about
huh?
some birds and some bees. So you have birds and bees. And why do I think that people aren't having the conversations? I think that folks are having, I think there are two answers to that question. One, I think that folks are having the conversations. Secondly, though, I think that there are ways that we can have the conversations a bit better.
Specifically in the church.
Yeah, but no, but I believe that churches are having the conversations. So every church I came up in, there were conversations happening. I think, though, that it's helpful for churches to be better equipped to have conversations that are much more helpful. I think also churches need to be more intentional about the conversation. But I don't want to act like churches aren't having any conversations, because I believe that some of those conversations are happening. So even here, I believe the conversations are happening, but I believe we can just be a bit more intentional as a collective around the conversations. The second thing, though, is I believe there's some generational dynamics. So if you look at baby boomers, a major focus for baby boomers, or a major cultural value for baby boomers, that generation of baby boomers, is appropriateness. And for baby boomers to have conversations around sex just was not appropriate to happen in church. Baby boomers, to wear your hat in church drove them crazy, because that's not what you did in church. I think that as you're getting more pastors who are Gen Xers and millennials, then you're finding that for them, their cultural values are more around authenticity. And so you're having these conversations happen a bit more as this generational shift happens in leadership in the church.
Okay.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on, you're talking about churches need to be more intentional with the conversations they're having. Maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, like meaning specifically talking about sex education and like birth control methods, or like,
Okay. So when I talk about churches need to be a bit more intentional, they need to be a bit more intentional on a few levels. One, churches need to be a bit more intentional in talking to parents about how to have conversations with their young people. Two, churches need to be a bit more intentional about having frank, honest dialogue, not just one-way conversations with their young people. Three, I do believe from a curriculum standpoint, it's helpful for churches to be able to talk about everything and a range of things, talking about sex ed, talking about birth control, and dealing with all those kinds of pieces. And not just around teen or unplanned pregnancy, but just around sex and sexuality stuff. And even so, say here, we don't deal just with sex, we deal with HIV and STDs. And dealing with those kinds of issues as well. So I think that churches need to be able to shape and have conversations, but not just one-way conversations again, but dialogue, having creative spaces for young people to be able to come and talk, parents to be able to come and talk about these issues that are impacting their lives.
So what do you think the experience of young teenage boys and girls have been ignored in the church? I mean, what do you think their experience has been like, and how do you think they feel about it?
Say that in a different way?
Basically, if you were to take a young man or a young woman that's in the church that feels like they can't talk about these topics,
Right.
what do you think? How do you think they feel about it? Do you think they're just not going to talk about it? Do you think they're just like wanting somebody to approach about this subject, or
Okay.
How do you think they feel about it?
So I think there are a couple of things. One, I think that young people will talk to trusted voices. So if they're with people that are trusted voices, people who authentically care, people who have shown care in other areas of their life, then young people would want to be able to talk to those voices. I think the challenge is the church has allowed the world to talk to young people, has allowed musicians to monopolize the conversation, has allowed pop culture to monopolize has allowed their peers to monopolize the conversation. But young people want to talk to adults who actually have experience in these kinds of areas to be able to have a frank conversation. So I think the church is one of those spaces to be able to have the conversation. But I also think empowering parents and significant older loved ones to have the conversations in other spaces is very helpful as well. So for me, the reason I say that, like, I remember having these conversations with youth leaders decades ago coming up in the church. And those were the people who I trusted to have the conversations with. And so I just believe that when churches have been able to shape that kind of an atmosphere, I think it can be extremely helpful.
So do you have any programs in place that kind of address these issues, or what kind of program do you think like churches in general should put in place to help combat these issues?
So we've had a few different kinds of programs. So we do some sex ed stuff here, and that's not just around teen and unplanned pregnancy. That's also is a huge part around STDs and HIV. That we also do trainings pieces around here around STDs and HIV, and just around general sex stuff. We also have regular youth pieces. We call it Real Talk, in which our young people sit in groups with youth leaders and are able to have conversations around a range of things. So not just around sex ed stuff, but just around a range of issues that young people deal with. We also have mentoring programs here in which our young people are able to be with mentors and trusted people who develop the kind of relationships so that when those issues do come up in their lives, they're able to have those kinds of pieces. So, and just our general youth ministry stuff. So it's not just, for me, it's not just about having formal kinds of spaces that have these conversations, but it's also being able to just shape some of the relationships so that when a young person has the need to have these conversations, there are people they can reach out to. And so there are a range of kinds of pieces we have here at Community of Hope.
Okay. So if a young man or young woman comes up to you and says, they confide in you and say, Reverend Lee, I think I got my girlfriend pregnant, or Reverend Lee, I'm pregnant myself as a young girl. I mean, what's been your experience, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I think there are a couple of pieces. One, we talk to them about what that means. We talk to them about the responsibility in the midst of that. We've had it happen, and we talk to them about the need to talk to their parents about it. And sometimes they're nervous about talking or sharing it with their parents, and so we end up helping them talk to their parents about it and let their parents know. And we've been in those kinds of settings, whether it's myself or the youth minister, to go with the young person to their parents and talk with them about it. But then we also deal with the parents, because the parents' reaction is important in the midst of this and the kind of support they get. We also deal with our youth leaders and how we're going to support the young man or the young woman in the midst of it right here at the church, letting them know that their church is not going to let go of them during this moment, but their church really is going to grab a hold of them and give them even more support during this type of a moment, and will be there for them, not just in the midst of this moment, for the duration. And so that's kind of how we approach it. For us, it's not a time to push a young person to the side. It's not a time to push them outside of being able to participate, but it's a time to help them more fully participate in whatever we have here, because it's a time that they need to know that church is there for them, is there with them, and has their back, and has their child's back, and believes in greatness for their child, and doesn't believe that because this has happened, it means that they're going to fail, it means their child is going to be a failure, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure they're successful in life, their child is successful in life, and they both are able to become the greatness God has called them to become.
So do you have any success stories, per se, of anybody like that you could speak of? Like, they had a kid early on and they've gone on to do great things in life?
So we're 10 years old. I don't have like their child is now 22 and is a graduate from college kind of a thing. I can say in my history in ministry, yes, I do. I can say in ministry, yes, we've seen that. But I can give I can give something that's happened even recently with a young lady. I think she's about 13, who recently has had a child. And our level of support for her, the challenge initially with parents being upset and concerned, and us being able to really work with the parents to be fully supportive and not fully supportive. That even people in the church, how you have to talk with them. Because there are people who had worked with her and had levels of disappointment, but for us it was like, you don't have the right to, show disappointment. We have to show the kind of support that's needed. And so for us, from the pastor on down, executive leadership on down, showing the levels of support, so that even right now you just have this whole group of people who have surrounded her with support, surrounded her child with support. Her baby's still a baby, a little baby, not about 4 months old, but that level of support, I consider that a win. I consider that kind of support a win. That we have others that, they have had their child, and their child is doing wonderful. The parent is doing wonderful. The parent is moving forward in their life and has been able to be successful, whether it's high school graduation, college graduation, whether it's getting a job and being able to work successfully, whether it's being able to have all the support systems around them to help them do and be successful in those areas they need to be successful in. So we've got those kinds of stories.
Good. So how do we reach out to the young men in this situation? Because it seems like a lot of times that the burden is really carried by the young ladies. Mm-hmm. But how do we get, reach out to the young men, and, why do you think it's important to?
Well, so I think for us, even when I gave some of those situations, that when I think about it, some were young men and some were also young women. And I think the piece is making sure that young men understand their level of responsibility. Young men understanding what it means to be a father and the significance and importance of fatherhood. And dealing with young men about the importance of really stepping up to the plate and not being able to use this as an excuse kind of to fall back and act like the child is either not theirs or they don't have the same level of responsibility to the child. And so for us, it really is patterning out as a congregation the significance, the importance of manhood. And what it means to be able to own up to your responsibilities and to step up to the plate.
Okay. So as a congregation, what step or steps can a congregation take to address these issues?
A few things, and I think I shared a little bit earlier. One is shaping the mechanisms or the systems to have the conversation with parents about just these kinds of how to have conversations with their children around sex. The second is shaping the spaces, the safe spaces for young people to have these conversations, which are educating them, but also for them to just talk, having the conversations about sex with young people and shaping the spaces in which they can not just be talked to, but have just conversations about what's happening for them. In the kind of language they need to have it with the kind of folks who they feel they can have authentic conversations with. And three, being able to shape things so that these kinds of issues are talked about not just in these private spaces, but from the pulpit. And so on Sunday mornings, having these levels of conversation, whether it's in sermons, whether it's in kind of pastoral, ministerial moments, but having these kinds of conversations. And then shaping the curriculum, having curriculum in place, as well as just these various kinds of ministries that deal with young people and with parents, so that it allows young people to be able to understand things about decision making and what it means and a responsibility.
Just one last question. How do you think the Bible speaks to these issues?
How the Bible speaks to, to parenthood and to
parenthood and pregnancy and all that.
Oh, I mean, well, so I guess if you look at the Bible, one of the most amazing instances of an unplanned pregnancy would be Jesus. That was as unplanned as you get. But what you saw was everybody take responsibility, whether it's, a guy who he didn't even have sex with the woman, but yet, he takes responsibility and just steps up to the plate. I think one of the things we can learn from Jesus is that every life is important. Every life is valuable. Every life is significant, and community has got to come around the mother and the father and the child to make sure that even in the midst of an unplanned pregnancy, that there's significance and love there. A personal story for myself is that my mother, when she was young, was at a church, she was in college, had an unplanned pregnancy by a gentleman who didn't want to step up and take responsibility. And she was in college at the time, had to leave the program in college, had to come back home. And the deaconesses of that church came to her house and told her mother that she was going to have to come and stand in front of the church and apologize. And God bless my grandmother, who kicked them up out the house and then called the pastor. God bless that pastor, Earl Harrison, who told my mother's mother, tell Nancy she has nothing to worry about and I'll deal with those deaconesses. You had a church in which you had some folks in the church that were so caught up in dealing with what's sin or not sin and dealing with, appropriateness, that they were going. Now, they didn't say the father had to come, but Nancy had to come before the church and apologize to the church for letting them down. But you had a pastor who said that I'm going to stand with you, I'm going to stand for you, and I'll fight the battle for you to make sure you understand your value, your child is of value, and you mean something before God. That meant so much to my mother. That child ended up dying at around 2 from some brain issues. But my mother knew, even in the death of the child, that child had value to God, that she had value to God. And now, years later, here goes my mother with 2 sons who are now both preachers. Here goes my mother, who is in the midst of a congregation in which she is able to deal with women and brothers who have unplanned pregnancies and can say, well, I had an unplanned pregnancy, but yet the pastor told me I had value and my child had value. There's no way in the world that I, as a pastor, could sit and not support one of our young men, our young women who had an unplanned pregnancy, because that would be like me disrespecting my mother, her own life story. We have stories like that all throughout the kingdom of God, to go all the way to the scripture. And so for me, it's important for us to realize that Jesus was an unplanned pregnancy, and you never know who a child can become, who a child will be. And you always have to love them with the love of Christ. That's our job. That's our responsibility.
Great. That's a wrap.
Yeah,
Good?
that was great.
Okay. Cool beans.